welcome to the Better Gaming Show, where we talk about all aspects of ethical gambling and how we can make it safe, secure and socially balanced for everyone. Today's episode is a bit different to the usual format, as we're talking about integrity in gambling, and the interesting part of this conversation will be discussing the balance of commercial success with compliance, social responsibility and genuine integrity. Helping me understand this balance is my guest today, Frazer McNaughton, the recently upgraded Director of Compliance at Betable. Firstly, Frazer, congratulations on your promotion. And secondly, thank you for being on this episode.
Hi, thank you. It's good to be here.
Excellent. Well, listen, going through your LinkedIn profile, you have a varied background in gambling, having worked at Midnight, at GamCare and William Hill. And the reason why I wanted to discuss this with you is the common theme in your job titles over the years, which are focused on values and standards and compliance. So with all of that in mind, and before we get into the industry stuff and talking about integrity, I want to start somewhere very simple and on a personal level. When we talk about integrity, what does it mean to you personally in your day-to-day life? And that's not with your Director of Compliance hat on, that's with your Frazer McNaughton as a family man.
It's an interesting question. I think for me, it's changed in the last few years. With my son being born, I've started to think about not so much being the hero in the story as being somebody that my son can be proud of when he's old enough to understand. And I think that for someone working in the gambling industry is sometimes quite conflicted. And what I mean by that is you often find people asking you things like, when you're sitting around the dinner table with family, how do you describe your job? And it's really difficult when you say that you work in the gambling industry because it's such a difficult environment in terms of the media perception, how the government portrays it. And quite often, before I moved into kind of generalist head of Director of Compliance roles, I looked at it as being kind of the thin blue line. I was the guy that was stopping people from coming to too much harm. And what I really want in day-to-day life is not to be portraying myself as the hero. Like, I just want to be someone that Archer can be proud of.
So the common media perception of the gambling industry is quite a negative one. And then obviously there are lots of good people trying to do good work within the industry. How does the term integrity vary when you're working within the industry, you know, as a different slant from what you just described on a personal level?
It varies from person to person within the industry, from operator to operator. Where I think integrity really comes into its own is through a compliance lens, through a player protection lens. And what I mean by that is you can absolutely focus on nailing the commercials. There are ways to make money in gambling from customers without callously causing harm. And I think there's terminology in kind of the game design world around addiction by design, for example. And I have met a few game designers, both in the gambling industry and kind of in the wider games industry where there's microtransactions involved, where they've said things like, I would never let my children play an app because of the microtransactions and the micro gambling that's involved in it. And I think the integrity piece comes into, well, if you wouldn't let your kids do it, right? And I think what we can do as compliance officials, especially when we've got a seat at the commercial table, is start to look at, well, how do we build safer games? How do we build games that are still engaging, still entertaining, less addictive? And how do we frame that when we go into a business to customer environment? How do we make that as safe as possible for the vast majority of customers?
And just with regard to that, the commercial element versus the integrity aspect, I guess the main question, and it's something that you, I think, are going to confirm, that can you be compliant and still hold your integrity? And it's something that you would probably say yes. And I would agree with you on it. But it also leads into you often do opinion pieces and blog posts under your other hat that you wear, which is the founder of the Ministry of Tactical Yeses. Is that something that, you know, helps you balance integrity and compliance with the commercial successes? You're just in understanding that you're in the real world, things aren't black and white. And I think whenever you're talking about something like integrity, people want it as black and white, and it's just not.
Yeah, I mean, specifically talking about like the Ministry of Tactical Yeses, it's about framing a playbook where compliance has a seat at the table and where we can have open and transparent conversations with members of the board, members of commercial teams, people that matter to the business, in a way where we can steer them and help them to be ethically good, but also continue to make good business decisions. The number of meetings that I've sat in the last kind of 18 months where my input hasn't just been stamping feet saying, no, you can't do this, that's illegal. And where actually I've sat there and went, yes, we can do that, but and if we do something else, it'll be more commercially viable. And it reduces that exposure to risk, potential for a fine, potential for complaints, any kind of backlash from that, what you're doing. And really what we're looking at is finding ways to say yes and to stuff rather than always no.
Yeah. Okay. And do you find that conversation has evolved? You mentioned it in the last 18 months, but let's take it back. How has the definition or the expectation of integrity in the industry evolved from your perception? So this is just your perception across many interactions with different people of different levels. How has that definition or expectation changed in the last 10 years?
I think walking into a betting shop for the first time in my life in 2017 to interview for William Hill was a very, very different landscape to where we were immediately pre-pandemic. And again, completely changed again over the last 5 years. And what I mean by that is when I joined William Hill, there was still this attitude of betting shop versus the punter. The notion of responsible gambling had not yet evolved into safer gambling at the time. And a responsible gambling interaction was a scanned form where you maybe wrote 3 sentences when you had a conversation with someone that had punched the machine. And that kind of evolved over the next few years. And when I moved into the safer gambling team, like down in Leeds with William Hill, started to roll out this idea of it being a much more all-encompassing interaction where player safety was actually considered and involved instead of it being that box-ticking exercise of, we had conversations with the customer after they'd already been harmed. And it's moved on again from there. And I mean that both from a retail perspective, which is what I was talking about there, into an online perspective. Looking at when I was at NetBet, we rolled out the first affordability platform for the UK at registration. The Gambling Commission has become a little more heavy-handed. There's a little more pressure on operators now to actively go above and beyond and quote unquote do the right thing. So we did that a little bit at NetBet. So NetBet was coming off the back of a fairly substantial fine for the time. One of the remediation goals to get them back in good standing was to solve affordability, which no one had done yet. So I think something that I've been able to be at the kind of pointy end of since the start of my career in the gambling industry has always been innovating for good and innovating for the better of the customer. And that's something that I'm really excited about. And I think, yes, the gambling industry gets a really bad rap in the media. Don't think we're all bad.
Yeah. And can you share an example of when maintaining integrity cost business or revenue? Because what I'm commonly coming across is this example of its integrity and compliance or profit and revenue. And I don't necessarily think it has to be that extreme, but then I'm not really at the coalface of an operator that is driven by commercial targets.
Fair. I think there's the example that I just gave there when we were rolling out affordability at registration at NetBet. When we did it very robustly, but we did it quite heavy-handedly. And what I mean by that is every single customer that came on had an affordability assessment straight off the bat. And the absolute maximum that customer might have got was £1,000 per month. And that was in a reasonably extreme edge case, where you had someone 120 grand plus in a not high risk occupation, et cetera, et cetera. So what that had actually done was it massively reduced the volume of customers that were able to punt at the volume they wanted to punt at, particularly because it was a gross deposit limit, not a loss or net deposit limit. So when you talk about commercial costs to doing the right thing, I think there's always going to be trailblazers and people that are cutting a path that learn hard lessons that do damage to the bottom line. But those same trailblazers learn lessons and they go to other operators and they do it better. and it proliferates out across the industry until it's the normal standard practice. And I think that's something that has kept me coming back to the industry, even when I left a little while to go to GamCare. I came back to the industry because I genuinely missed that innovation and that drive to do things better, differently.
Okay, cool. And then just with regard to, I'm going to move on to sort of an area in a little bit, and specifically black market. But as it currently stands, where do you think the biggest pressures are that like test an operator's integrity? You know, where is that pressure coming from? Is it coming from the Gambling Commission? Is it coming from the general public? Is it coming from shareholders or competitors, or just the market conditions? I guess market conditions probably would allude to the black market, just in terms of the elements that you're talking about when you were talking about affordability checks. The absolute lack of those sort of checks and measures in those things makes it so much less friction and easier to onboard. Just going back, a very long question. So just to reframe it, where are the biggest pressures when it comes to testing an operator's integrity?
I think there's you touched on a few of them there. Complying with regulatory requirements as they get more and more strict is difficult. It's not necessarily a bad thing by any means. I think sometimes the only way to make an industry behave better is to regulate and make it a requirement. But we're starting to see a general public where the non-gambling portion of the public is much more offended by the gambling industry than the gambling portion of the public is. You're seeing statistics coming out of research like 60% plus of punters will straight up refuse to give any form of documentation beyond ID, because they do not believe that they should be sharing their private documentation to engage in a vice that they are quite happy to continue with. They don't get asked for a bank statement to get a pint at the pub. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's an interesting dichotomy for me between the customers who we actually serve versus the political agenda. And I think the current political movement and the lobbying movement against the gambling industry is going to do real damage to the regulated sector. It's going to do real damage to consumers who are going to have less and less access to honest products. And what I mean by that is you've currently got hundreds of genuinely honest operators in good standing with the Gambling Commission who are doing a good job and are doing the best they can in really the tightest set of regulations in the world, theoretically, for gambling. And what happens when it becomes harder for these businesses to make an honest buck is it becomes more tempting for them to make a dishonest buck, and they stop being as willing to go above and beyond, and they start towing the line, ticking the boxes, complying for the sake of complying. And that's where you start to see harm creeping into what is otherwise a well-regulated sector.
Yeah. That's a great answer. I mean, one of the things that you just touched on there is something in my personal life. I'm going to do full disclosure now that, so for my sins, I'm quite big on crypto, just in terms of being, you know, there's a common phrase in crypto about being your own bank. And as much as I appreciate all the checks and measures that the banks have to do to prevent fraud, for anti-money laundering, and just to make sure everything's legit and to protect vulnerable people, at the same time, I absolutely grinds my gears when being asked multiple times, is this a legitimate transfer of money, or, you know, why are you using it? And I have been, I have been really riled about those sort of checks. And I guess it's one of these elements as well, that when you've got that sort of like free and loose ability or access to a market that doesn't have to play by those rules, as much as you've got really good, compliant and, you know, good intended operators out there, they must just be looking across and they're going, but we're getting punished and fined for our activity here, and this is being let to, you know, burn freely across the same people.
Yeah, I think you're right. And just to go back to like your banking analogy versus crypto, I don't even think it is just people that are using crypto anymore. I recently had to close an account with one of the major banks because they froze my salary payment going in and claimed that it was somehow fraudulent, despite the fact that I'd been getting the same salary payment for however many months at that point. And I think it speaks to regulated industries becoming increasingly paranoid about money in general. And the gambling industry is no different. The difference being is that the perception up until very, very recently of the Gambling Commission is that paranoia might have been quite real. There were operators that were openly hostile towards the Commission in that they effectively expected to get a fine every 3 to 5 years. I think the wind is changing in that regard. I think the Commission has moved leaps and bounds over the past 2, maybe 3 years to shift that perspective, to be much more open, much more transparent, and certainly to demystify the assessment process and what a passing grade looks like. Whereas before it was very rubber bandy. It was your mileage may vary depending on who was assessing you or depending on what your reputation was publicly and things like that. And that's moved on a lot. So I think, I don't think that could be a bad thing.
Okay. Just with regard to, obviously, in your role currently, you go across different jurisdictions, right? Different gambling commissions. And then when it comes to integrity, one of my main things would be that obviously there's varying standards, I think. Am I right in saying that the UK is sort of like held as the gold standard, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah. Particularly from a safer gambling perspective, it's held as the gold standard. I think there are some places that are nipping at its heels. The DCOJ in Spain is doing some pretty good and effective safer gambling work. There are some slightly more overbearing regulators. Germany is a standout example where the safer gambling aspect of Germany is arguably excessive and it's damaging the market in a very similar way to what's starting to happen to the UK. But from an anti-money laundering perspective, there are regulators out there that do things, in my opinion, better than the UKGC. There's the Ontario Gaming Commission. Their anti-money laundering rules are incredibly prescriptive, which is really helpful because it means that you're not operating in a grey area. You're not operating in what is fast becoming one of my least favorite sentences, risk-based approach. You're operating on a basis of customer has hit a threshold, or customer has had a behavior, or customer has deliberately narrowly missed a threshold. And all of these are just, you report it and you let law enforcement decide whether or not it matters, instead of it being very judgment-based here, which when you consider the legal pressure on MLROs and senior officials within a business, where if you allow money laundering and sanction individuals and such like to go through your business, you can go to jail for years. And it could have been on a very genuinely innocent judgment call where you didn't think there was sufficient burden of proof to escalate that to law enforcement. Whereas in Canada, you just escalate it. I'm sure I'm barbarically oversimplifying that, but I think, the UK is definitely one of the most robust gambling authorities, but there's still room for them to do things, in my opinion, better.
When it comes to the different jurisdictions, and you mentioned a couple of them, talking about, having superior standards with anti-money laundering, for example, when you're then looking across all of that portfolio, across all those jurisdictions, does that knowledge and that ability to see better standards, does that raise the game so that you don't just see it as a threshold to cross to be compliant, but to raise it beyond that minimum standard?
I think 2 answers to that. One is the compliance answer, which is there are definitely places where there are lower standards to comply and to pass an assessment. But the wider answer, and I suppose the more correct answer, is you still need to be able to justify your actions to the board. You still need to be able to justify the actions to law enforcement in your whatever the headquartered company location is. Because ultimately, if law enforcement show up in Manchester, where our office is, and they say, we think you've been allowing money laundering in an international geo, that's still allowing money laundering. So you need to make sure that you hold yourself to the standard, like equally high standards from an internal perspective, whether or not ticking the boxes is easier or harder in different geos.
Yeah, this is where I find it really fascinating because, so I'm licensed by the Gambling Commission, but I'm literally like pretty low stakes in comparison to, the online casinos, the operators, the sports books, all of those sort of guys. And one of the things that I find is when I'm asked by my bosses, and I say, hand on heart, I say, we are compliant, but we could be more compliant.
Mhm.
And I was talking to a consultant who they were talking specifically with regard to the UK market. And they controversial, I won't mention their name, but they basically said, to be fully compliant in the UK, it would just make it not feasible to operate as ongoing commercial concern.
Credit where credit's due to the Gambling Commission. They do allow an element of risk-based approach. And where the Commission is misunderstood, in my opinion, a little bit, is there is complying with the LCCP, which is, for the most part, reasonably easy to do on a checkbox basis. What operators fall down on is not following their own policies and procedures in attempting to tick those boxes. So you might, for example, have a policy in line with 3.4.3 where you have to call a customer who reaches medium risk from a safer gambling perspective, and that's all fine in a vacuum. Then you have an analyst that decides to overrule that decision, decides the customer is medium risk based on what your policy threshold say medium risk is, and decides not to call the customer because we phoned them last week, or because customer good, long-standing, we've got loads of proof of documents, all the rest of it. Whatever potentially innocent, potentially financially motivated decision that is, it flies in the face of policy and process, and that is where a lot of operators that do fall foul, rather than directly contravening the commission's commitments. I would caveat that with the ones that get the major public statements. Sometimes that's not quite so true. But the ones that are quietly being sanctioned or put into special measures, situations where they can still redeem themselves, absolutely, these things are usually user error rather than glaring compliance failures.
Yeah. And just regard to that, moving it on a little bit, because you just mentioned about user error and the failing of staff and employees to actually enact and adhere to the policies of the company in order to comply with the LCCP. Obviously, technology, everyone's talking about AI, leaning into it. I know there's quite a few AI companies within the gambling space that are making big promises with regard to, their role in maintaining integrity and improving integrity. How do you see technology moving specifically with regard to this? And is there, on the flip side of the error that we were talking about in people not adhering to policies, will there always be a need for human input in these scenarios? Because it's just simply things that technology, as it currently stands, would not be able to interpret.
My opinion on this changes almost daily. I think there are a few kind of end game scenarios that I can see in the not too distant future, where either humans are elevated into this judgment decision framework where AI does all of the legwork and then knocks the finished product up the chain to be reviewed and decided upon. Or we could get the quote unquote benevolent overlord situation where AGI happens and it can think faster, better, more ethically than a human, and it wants to do it for the greater good of humankind. And at that point, who's to get in the way of our robot overlords?
Fair answer. Fair answer. The other element that I was just talking about there when you were answering is culturally in all the different companies that you've worked with, but also ones that you've seen, with either peers or when you're networking. When it comes to sort of culture and integrity, where's been sort of real class examples of an operator? Obviously, I'm going to disallow your current employer as today, because obviously they're number one. But just culturally, where have been really good examples of good integrity within the gambling industry that you're aware of?
Fair question, way to put me on the spot. So I think there's been, in my experience, a few good examples of operators being willing to put out there the good that they're doing. I think rather than calling out specific operators, I would maybe call out
Or people.
scenario.
How about people?
People. Just list my heroes. I think there are some standout people in the industry or kind of in the orbit of the industry who absolutely do more good than harm. You've got people like Duncan Garvey, who, in my opinion, just deserves a knighthood.
I'm just going to have to buy in here. Great guy on LinkedIn, just in terms of his his responses, there's been something recently, I'm sure loads of people will be aware of it with the introduction of the new statutory levy and bet blocker receiving funding, but there was a bit of a subplot that went off. And I do have to doff my cap to Duncan just for the depth of replies that he does on LinkedIn. In my eyes, if I was in his position, we would just be like, well, I don't need to answer to anyone, but he respectfully takes the time to explain situations, explain what his position is, and he does it in a very amicable and nuanced way in which it's very respectful and just come across as a really nice guy.
First of all, he is absolutely a really nice guy. But yeah, I think I agree with that. I think there's very few people in the industry that can say that they've done as much as altruistically as what Duncan has. And I think the depth of reply that he, I suppose, almost feels forced to send out now is a sign of how much pushback he's had over the years doing the right thing.
Yeah. I think the other thing on his front as well is that, talking of integrity, I think there's a lot of that's been discussed with the statutory levy, just in terms of, whether you can have integrity in terms of trying to provide a service for gambling harm whilst also being or having investment or financial means from a gambling operator. And I think that's really, really stirred the pot with a lot of conversations going around with the third party sector charities. And I think that is probably something that's worthy of comment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough environment, right? The third sector has to move with the funding, and whether we or they like it or not, the funding has been pushed into an environment where it is almost verboten to be willing to engage with the industry. I think it's a real shame. I think there's a lot of innovation that's going to be lost from that. But that's the circumstances we find ourselves in, and there are going to be winners and losers from that. There's going to be, I mean, there already are an awful lot of people who I know well from my network, from working with them, from engaging with them in the past, that are now looking at how do they keep the lights on for these community interest projects and charities that do vital good, but in potentially a fairly niche area, or an area that was previously heavily funded by the industry. And the door closed to access to that levy is a bit of a shame. I would say a bit of a shame is probably undercooking it significantly.
I think just when you were answering that question there, I think probably as the conversation's gone on, we've loosened up a little bit and feel a little bit more free flowing with our comments and discussion points. And looking back and reflecting on the earlier questions where I've positioned the gambling industry as, with the negative media perception, which, I completely agree it has. I think on the flip side, when you're talking about the statutory level, you've also got the campaigners on the other side. And I have to be honest with you, I've been to the events held by the Peers for Gambling Reform, and I think they could potentially be holding themselves up as the bastions of hope and decency and honour against the gambling industry. But from my experiences, I will say they are so combative and so staunch in their opposition of the gambling industry that, it's almost that their integrity cannot be challenged. I would beg to differ whether you could actually challenge it, because I've reached out a number of times to them to discuss it, and that's as either campaigners or parliamentary MPs and commentators, and they just really do not want to involve themselves in any form of engagement with the gambling industry. They almost want it sort of on their narrative and their terms as it stands.
I think everyone is entitled to their opinion. And I think that particular group and the people that are behind the agenda there have their own experience of the gambling industry and their own views on how to save the world. And I think prohibition doesn't work. We've seen that evidenced literally during the prohibition era in America. It does not work. It's believing yourself to be fundamentally above reproach and refusing to engage with debate breeds in weakness. And I think I agree with you. I would prefer to engage with people who sit much more close to the abolitionist kind of leaning, discuss how that could be done better, how we could do the industry better in a safer, fairer way. The problem with that being, whether we in the industry now like it or not, some of these people have seen a lifetime of gambling industries saying this and not doing it.
Yeah, I guess as a relative newbie, I could be accused of being naive or, ill-informed on that matter. But, I do also believe that times are changing, technology is shifting, behaviors are changing. And just the society and the communities in which we live also change rapidly. And I think history repeating itself for some people may see it as an example of the inability to resolve and to change, but I probably don't hold it with that. I think there's sort of macro effects that will force people's hands to change. And on that, Mark, I'm just going to ask one question because we lent into it a little bit with regard to the black market, and we're talking about integrity. And this might be a podcast all on its own, but essentially, when you're talking about integrity and black market, you would probably put them at polar opposites. Is there an example, or could there be an example, of a black market operation that has integrity and could be held to a higher standard?
I don't see why not. And what I mean by that is look at the gambling companies pre-Gambling Act. Most of them are still here. Most of them are now operating under the very kind of regulation that was brought about by the necessity of these people operating unchecked. I think there's only a matter of time before crypto casinos get adopted wholesale into most, if not all, licensing regimes. Prediction markets are already well on their way in many environments. Whether or not the prediction markets want to be called gambling or not, the law is spoken. It's gambling in the UK until told otherwise. But I think there's all these operators out there. And I think I had a conversation with one of them relatively recently where they actually complained a little bit to me that their punters think they're over compliant because they ask for KYC, because they ask for certain proofs and things before they allow certain transactions to occur. So there are operators out there that are trying to set a voluntary standard, even if there's no regulation in place.
I mean, for me, just as an outsider looking in, that would petrify me if I was an operator, if I was aware of a black market site that was actually holding really high standards, but not being held to account. It would just blow all sort of arguments out of the water for me.
I think we are within grasp of a couple of years, if not sooner, of some of these operators coming to the fore. And, the ones that are going to be the real pioneers of the next generation of gambling commission licenses, where the commission might legislate for crypto casinos. They might legislate for forms of new that we haven't seen before. Who knows? I mean, prediction markets came out of arguably nowhere. Yeah, we had kind of variants back in the day, but at the volume that they're happening now is unprecedented. But I think these new generations are going to come through. This new legislation is going to come in at some point eventually, and if it's not in the UK, it'll come in elsewhere. And you're going to have these guys that are just competing on a different level from your legacy operators, where your legacy operators are almost fighting to catch up. These guys have got their UX nailed down. They've got their customer experience absolutely smashed, because let's be perfectly honest with the black market, they need to be better at attracting and retaining customers than what we do, because there isn't anything stopping customers from moving freely in amongst them.
I signed up recently to Kalshi, not as a punter, but just to have a look around, and and it's the slickness of the process that I'm witnessing and that I'm seeing is quite it's admirable and worrying at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get that. I assume, therefore, that you were the $40 million long on oil.
Not able to place. Unfortunately,
State factor, unfortunately.
Yeah. But these the prediction markets, and it's even simpler things like unregulated price draws. That's another one that I think there's real challenges when it comes to a whole host of categories and subsectors within the gambling industry that need to either fall in, or the players and the key components and the stakeholders need to sort of really tackle. And I do worry it's something that, there's a lot of challenges that are going to be faced. And I think a lot of, in the next 5-10 years, a lot of changes, both, from macro or technology, or from the social media, the media owners, Facebooks or WhatsApp. There's going to be a lot of things that are testing people's integrity as they work in gambling on a day-to-day basis. And it's definitely something to watch out for. So I guess it will be a good point to close off this conversation. I have found it fascinating, Frazer, talking to you about components of integrity within gambling. And as somebody who doesn't work on the operator side or at the coalface within the larger transactional side of gambling, it's fascinating to hear the challenges, how stark they are for somebody like you, both balancing on a commercial aspect, but also holding the companies that you work for, but also yourself to account, is something that is admirable, mate.
Yeah, I think something that I just want to call back before we quit. You mentioned about being relatively new to the industry and maybe being a bit naive. I hear a bit of an echo of past Frazer in that. I think there was that element of naivety, that wanting to save the world one person at a time. And it's something that, as I've moved into a more generalist compliance role, it's become a more nebulous concept of integrity. But I think that naivety, we need people like you to drive the cause forward, to drive what good looks like forwards, so that A, it keeps people like us honest, and B, you guys are going to be the ones that end up doing the innovative stuff. And yeah, sometimes that, like I say, does a little bit of damage to the bottom line on a very short-term basis while lessons get learned. That's how we pave the road forward.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you again for your time. It's been great to catch up. I've caught you on a few online courses and events, and obviously we met in the Operators Engagement Forum. Hopefully I'll see you in the one in July at the Gambling Commission are holding in Birmingham. But listen, Frazer, thanks a million for your time. What I'll do is I'll drop all of your contact details and places where people can contact you should they have any questions for you in the show notes. But on that note, that's all for this episode. Thanks a million for watching, and catch you in the next one. Hello and